Well, you know, I just remember, didn't Michael Moore once fall afoul of the law by speaking about Canadian politicians during an election? And that stayed in my mind. So, but he says the following: Israeli Apartheid Week is an attack on the mutual respect that holds our society together. It is a dangerous cocktail of ignorance and intolerance, both of which stand in the way of peace. The Liberal Party of Canada condemns Israeli Apartheid Week in no uncertain terms. Then there's some boilerplate about Middle East peace. You always have to say how committed you are to Middle East peace. And then he says Israeli Apartheid Week does the opposite by portraying the Jewish state as criminal, by demonizing Israel and its supporters, and by targeting Jewish and Israeli students for abuse on our university campuses. The organizers and supporters of Israeli Apartheid Week tarnish our freedom of speech. The voices of anti-Semitism and intolerance have no place in Canada, in the Middle East, or anywhere in the world. All Canadians and all university students have the right to feel safe and secure in our communities, regardless of who they are or what they believe. On behalf of the Liberal Party of Canada and our parliamentary caucus, I urge all Canadians to join us with us in once again condemning Israeli Apartheid Week here in Canada and around the world. He should have said, on behalf of the Liberal Party of Canada and our parliamentary caucus, I urge all Canadians to join with us in once again condemning Israeli apartheid here in Canada and around the world. It would have been a laudable statement. But seriously, the claim that the supporters of Israel, that the organizers of Israeli Apartheid Week are anti-Semitic, are anti-freedom, or are targeting Jewish and Israeli students for abuse on campuses is, in my view, probably libelous. And I hope that those who have been targeted by this scurrilous and scandalous accusation by Michael Ignatieff will pursue the question of whether or not these accusations are libelous. Of course, one Canadian who visited the occupied West Bank wrote about it in The Guardian of London on April 19th, 2002. He wrote about in a helicopter, and he wrote the following: "When I look down at the West Bank, at the settlements like Crusader forts occupying the high ground, at the Israeli security cordon along the Jordan River, closing off the Palestinian lands from Jordan, I knew I was not looking down at a state or the beginnings of one, but at a Bantustan, one of those pseudo-states created in the dying years of apartheid to keep the African population under control." Of course, those words were written by none other than Michael Ignatieff. So he's a hypocrite as well. And just so people don't think there's any party political goal here, if you bring me other statements from any other party leaders, I'd be happy to give them the same treatment. Of course, there is practices of apartheid, that Israel is built on an ideology that is akin to apartheid in so many ways. One of the notable facts about Israel's history is its close relationship with apartheid South Africa throughout the years in which the rest of the world was boycotting and isolating apartheid South Africa. A brilliant book came out on this just last year, The Unspoken Alliance, by I can't say the name of the author because I forget it. I mean, it's one of those names that doesn't stick. But it's a brilliant book, The Unspoken Alliance, which is a very detailed history of the close relationship, ideological affiliation, military cooperation, that most of the weapons that were used to crush the township uprisings in apartheid South Africa were made in Kibbutz Beit Alpha in what is now called Northern Israel. And of course, the kibbutzes were marketed to the world as these wonderful socialist communes, while Kibbutz Beit Alpha was exporting riot control gear and other weaponry to apartheid South Africa to crush the anti-apartheid struggle. Of course, at a time when most of the world had called for an arms embargo on South Africa, the Israelis outfitted almost completely the South African Air Force and Navy. The Israelis provided the South Africans with warplanes, which were used in over-occupied Namibia, what was then occupied by South Africa, and the Navy. When I was in South Africa last year, one of the former government ministers in the ANC government and one of the veterans of the anti-apartheid struggle, Ronnie Casriels, mentioned a story where he said that after 1994, he became deputy defense minister. And he said one of the things they learned was how shoddy the equipment was the Israelis had sold South Africa, and how poorly the Israeli-supplied warplanes had performed against the Soviet MiGs in Angola. But this is, the point here is this is quite uncontroversial. That history is well documented. Of course, Israel's role in nuclear proliferation. It's now believed, there's pretty good evidence that South Africa and Israel work closely on developing nuclear weapons. South Africa, of course, abandoned its nuclear weapons in 1994. Israel still maintains its nuclear weapons. One last point about the historic relationship, by the way. Those Bantustans, which Michael Ignatieff wrote about in his intolerant and anti-Semitic article in The Guardian in 2002, were the only country in the world that Bantustan, for those who aren't familiar with the term, was a word used to describe pseudo-states, nominally independent homelands for black South Africans that were created by the apartheid government in the 1970s and 80s as a kind of ruse. The basic demand of the black majority in South Africa was one person, one vote, full citizenship for all the people who lived in South Africa, including the descendants of the white colonists and settlers. And the apartheid government's response was, well, okay, you want political rights, that's all very well with us, we'll create states for you. And these black homelands, the Bantustans, were scattered enclaves. People were forced to move to them. They were often on very poor land, very far away from the urban and economic centers of South Africa. And they had puppet governments which were entirely controlled by and subsidized by South Africa with little local dictators. In fact, very much the model of the so-called Palestinian state that is emerging in the West Bank. And what you learn from the history is that the South Africans came to Israel in the 1980s. I wrote about this in my book, which I'm going to plug now because it's very heavy. It's a light read. very heavy in your suitcase, so I'm hoping you won't make me take them away from Regina with me. But one of the things I wrote about is in the 1980s, the South Africans coming to Israel to study how Israel managed its problem with the Palestinians. And Meron Ben-Benisti, who was deputy mayor of Jerusalem, recalls a meeting where the South Africans came and said, you know, we've come to learn how you deal with this. And the Israelis are shocked. They say, what do you mean? You have a horrible system of apartheid, and we're a wonderful, enlightened state. And the South Africans look at them bewildered and say, what do you mean? We have the same problem, and we've come up with the same solution, and we want to see how you're managing it. And that was a wake-up call for them. But the history is there. The present today is one where you can see the ideology at the root of apartheid. And by the way, apartheid, when you talk about one of the sort of red herring arguments used against saying that Israel is an apartheid state as well. Oh, well, Israel is so different from South Africa. Well, of course it's different from South Africa. No two countries are identical. Israel doesn't have to be identical to apartheid South Africa for the charge of apartheid to stick. Because the crime of apartheid is defined in international law. It's defined by a UN treaty on the crime of apartheid. And the crime of apartheid, if you look it up, you Google it, you'll find it is defined as a system that is designed to provide racial privilege for one group of people over another. A system, systematic policies and practices. And this is what you see infused in every aspect of Israeli law, policy, and practice, and even to an increasing degree popular culture, is a denigration of Palestinians, a denial of their existence. At least in Canada, there is now official acknowledgement that indigenous people were here and were wronged. You have some redress on specific issues. There is recognition of the damage that was done by the wholesale kidnapping of native children and forcing them into residential schools whose goal was to erase and eliminate their culture and their identity and to turn them into sort of mirror images of at the time the colonists imagined a white Christian Canadian should look like. Well, in Palestine after 1948, there was a systematic effort by Israel to erase any trace of Palestinian existence before the State of Israel. Systematic erasure of Palestinian place names. Hundreds of mosques were demolished or destroyed. Some of them still exist and have been turned into nightclubs, for example. There are many cases. Meron Ben-Benisti, who I mentioned earlier, the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, wrote a brilliant book about this called Sacred Landscape in 2000, in which he talks about the systematic effort to erase any trace of Palestinian existence. Of course, the basic constitution of Israel, and I use constitution with a small c, because Israel has no single written document that is a constitution. It has a series of basic laws and other laws that amount to a constitution, but it doesn't have a Bill of Rights. There's no such thing in Israel as a Charter of Rights. There's no definition of a citizen that says that all citizens have such and such rights, because citizens in Israel don't have those rights. You have different classes of citizenship. Israel is the only state in the world today that is not the state of its citizens. And what do I mean by that? Israel claims to be the state of the Jewish people, wherever they are. So if you go to a website called